we shall commence this module by discussing about forest policy. Forest policy is a policy for the society and not for forest administration. The battle against climate change cannot be won without the world's most valuable resource, which is the forests. Managing the transition to sustainable, low carbon and resource efficient economies will depend on the availability of forest resources, as will the scaling up of renewable energy. The quality of life in both rural as well as urban areas would depend upon their ability, the ability of people to enjoy food, clean drinking water, and have recreation and greenery. Forests can significantly contribute to all of this in most of the countries. The task of policymakers is to recognize the value and significance of forests for society and to establish sound policies to assure this value is actually delivered to the society. Therefore, in the past, forests were normally delegated to technical experts for their management. But now, policymakers and stakeholders from different backgrounds look to forests towards a renewed attention. Developing policies that work in practice is difficult. It requires connecting many diverse and often conflicting interests of different stakeholders, and it requires achieving long-term agreements that these stakeholders adhere to as it is in their own interest. Many countries introduce or amend policies that govern the forests to incorporate changing dynamics and to augment the value of forests to society, including through the support of Food and Agricultural Organization (FAO). The experience from various countries and FAO has shown that significant changes have been witnessed since the publication of FAO's guidelines for forest policies formulated in 1987. The present module aims at explaining the significance of forest policy, policy formulation, issues to be considered while framing the forest policy, and to give a brief idea about global forest policy. Forest policy is what governments choose to or do not do about forests within their jurisdiction. That is, that there are certain things which are to be done for the forest and certain things which should not be done with the forest. Forests are usually the subject of government action because they provide a mix of public goods, for example, the ecosystem services like streams, air, and so on, oxygen. The private goods are things like fiber, wood, and other minor forest products. Almost every forest policy is based on a combination of the approaches or the what are called the policy levers, which the government uses to influence human behavior. These include defining property rights and responsibilities, monitoring users, and professions connected with the forest with civil and criminal sanctions. Thirdly, taxing or subsidizing products and services, requiring submission of management information, providing technical information, research and education, and sixthly, creating markets for public goods and common pool of resources. One of the most prominent forest policy issues is to define forest tenure, which allocates rights of the use, ownership and duties amongst the individual owners, groups and the government. In many nations, post-colonial tenure schemes contradict with the aboriginal rights and the traditional uses. In most of the developed nations, governments monitor the use of private and public forests through a system of civil and criminal sanctions. Some of the jurisdictions mention harvest seasons and the hours of the day when the harvesting may occur. Regulations for protecting wetlands and the water quality are common as the regeneration required. Increasingly, governments regulate transactions in forest products across regions and in international boundaries, either to support local industry or to minimize the effects to the introduction of pests. In many developed nations, governments modulate the professions associated with forest management, including foresters, wildlife and fisheries biologists, and hydrologists. Many of the government administrators who may or may not use the forest through a system of licenses and user fees. In some jurisdictions, only registered or licensed professionals are allowed to implement timber and exploit forest timber and other resources. In most cases, these procedures for regulating use and users are implemented through a system of administrative fees and permits. Criminal and civil sanctions are less often employed. Many governments execute forest policy by asking users to provide details of their activities. Many governments carry out periodic inventories to detect changes in the forest cover, land use, and the volume of distributions. This management information system is increasingly important and has been incorporating changes in the role of forests to improve global climate change and to provide fiber in the international market. Many governments subsidize tax forests and forest produce and facilities that process them. Privately owned forests are usually required to pay property tax levied by local, provincial and state governments. In inter-jurisdictional trade, export and import taxes are often used to enhance domestic forest production and it facilitates expansion. Subsidies to private forest owners are ubiquitous as ubiquitous as forest taxes. Many governments provide funds to a number of forest research institutes either directly as official agencies or through providing grants to universities. Besides, many governments finance technology transfer and extension programs are also carried out. An evolving public policy tool for government is the augmentation of markets for pollution credits, carbon credits, as a part of the cap and trade program. Under this approach, government caps the volume and amount of pollutants that can be emitted and assigns initial allocations to the existing polluters. Facilities that use less than their permit levels of emissions may sell their difference through the market to purchasers who want to expand emissions. While it is in an infant stage, a market for carbon sequestration using forest projects exists in several regions. After studying this module, you will be able to know about what is forest policy, know about the importance and objectives of forest policy, comprehend various functions of the Indian Forest Policy Division, know about global forest policy, compare forest policy and forest law, analyze the process of formulating forest policy, know about various issues to be considered while framing a forest policy. Let us first understand the objectives of a forest policy. Forest policy goals must be clearly linked to national development strategies. To foster stakeholder ownership, which leads to better policy execution, is the first and foremost goal. Secondly, to provide a forum for negotiation on conflicting interests, to build a shared vision to guide the prospective decisions and activities, to guide cohesive organizational framework and policy tools including forest legislation, to create an enabling environment that empowers stakeholders, and finally to guide the development of strategies for responding to emerging issues. Next, we shall discuss the functions of Indian Forest Policy Division. The Indian Forest Policy Division transacts with the National Forest Policy 1988. The Indian Forest Act 1927 also runs parallel. The division acts as a think tank on forest policy issues and works for their integration with other natural resource management sectors. The division conducts review of national forest policy to align with the recent developments and changes in the socio-economic, scientific and legal frameworks. The division works on international forest policy processes and deals with United Nations Forum on Forests on international agreements on forests. The division acts as a nodal point for various bilateral and multilateral international cooperations on forestry related matters. It also conducts bilateral visits of forest delegations from other countries. The head of the division is a Deputy Inspector General of Forests. The head of the division gets assistance from the Assistant Inspector General of the Forest and a technical officer. Moving on, now we discuss the mandate or the subject matter of Forest Policy Division. First of all, the National Forest Policy in 1988 and the State Forest Policies. This is one of the mandates. The Indian Forest Act 1927 and other forest legislations excluding Forest Conservation Act 1980, Wildlife Protection Act 1972 and Biological Diversity Act 2002. The forest related matters and issues related to the policies and legislations of other central ministries and departments. The harmonization of Indian Forest Act with Forest Rights Act 2006 and the PESA 1996 in coordination with the Ministry of Tribal Affairs and the Ministry of Panchayat Raj. Establishment of policies and guidelines on various forestry matters. Nodal division of forest related to climate change, REDD and biodiversity issues in the ministry and coordinates for implementation of the programs and products related to REDD plus. Forest Plus etc. provides forest inputs to the climate change and other divisions of the ministries under the Millennium Development Goals and so on. Nodal division for coordination of the execution of USAID Forest Plus program. Forest Ministers Conference meeting on climate change etc. Policy aspects of joint forestry management, National Forest Commission, International Day on Forests, World Forestry Congress, convener of the consultative group meeting for international negotiations on forest concerns. Now let us understand global forest policy. A brief to the global forest policy. Global forest policy has been initiated in a number of fora. The following detail reviews the deliberations on forests and results from discussions held at various conferences, committees, organizations and panels which are mentioned. United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development, UNCED, is one such forum. Forests were amongst the most controversial issues considered during the preparation of the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in 1992. Some delegates from developed countries desired a forest treaty, but the north-south polarization on the issue only permitted on the non-legally binding authoritative statement of principles for a global consensus on management and conservation and sustainable development of all types of forests. This is also known as the Forest Principles and Chapter 11 of Agenda 21 on combating deforestation. Inter-governmental Panel on Forests, IPF. By 1995, the evolving North-South partnership on the matter enabled Commission on Sustainable Development at the third session CSD3 to establish the Intergovernmental Panel on Forests to continue the Intergovernmental Forest Policy Dialogue. During the period of its mandate, that is 2 years, the IPF developed over 100 negotiated proposals for activities on various matters connected to the sustainable forest management, including national forest programs, forest assessment, criteria and indicators, traditional forest related knowledge, and the underlying causes of deforestation. Inter-governmental Forum on Forests (IFF). The IFF met 4 times between October 1997 and January 2007 to identify the possible elements of working towards a consensus on international arrangements and mechanisms. For example, the legally binding instruments. In addition to this issue, the IFF produced conclusions and approximately 120 proposals for the action on issues including encouraging execution and regulatory progress of the IPF suggestions for action, for trade, for environment, and the underlying causes of deforestation. Also, for traditional forest related knowledge, for forest preservation and protection, protected areas, forest research, valuation of forest goods and services, future supply of and demand for wood and non-wood forest products, and the assessment, monitoring and rehabilitation of forest cover in environmentally critical areas. The United Nations Forum on Forests UNFF on 18th October 2000, ECOSOC accepted a resolution which is E 2000/35 stating an international pact on forests and establishing the UNEF, the United Nations Environmental Fund, as a subsidiary of ECOSOC. The resolution states that the major aim of the International Pact on Forests is promoting, managing, preserving, and sustainable development of various types of forests and to provide more strength to long-term political commitment to this end. The main goal is to encourage the execution of internationally agreed activities on forests at the regional, national and global levels. Committee on Forestry (COFO) of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. The biennial sessions of COFO, organized at the FAO headquarters, takes along the heads of forestry services and other senior public officers to recognize evolving strategies and technical matters, seeks resolutions and advise FAO and other organizations on suitable action. The International Tropical Timber Organization (ITTO). This organization has been formed under the International Tropical Timber Agreement. It was discussed under the support of United Nations Conference on Trade and Development (UNTAD). The major objectives of ITTA are negotiations to provide an efficient framework for cooperation and negotiation between countries that produce and consume tropical timber. Next, we shall understand the distinguishing features of forest policy and forest law. These are the main differences between forest policy and forest law. Forest policy can be adopted and amended through different procedures and that are laid down by different bodies. Forest law is adopted and amended by the Parliament or the head of the state through certain set procedures. Secondly, the forest policy is non-legally binding. Forest law is legally binding. Forest policy provides guidance specifying vision and how to reach certain goals. Forest law specifies rights and duties based on a policy vision or goal. Fourthly, forest policy can be general, so it can be accepted to meet different changing circumstances. Forest law has to be specific to enable judicial dispute settlement, and it can be applied universally. Forest policy is a soft mechanism to deal with non-compliance, and under forest law there are judicial powers to punish non-compliance. Amended by those bodies, that is some of the bodies which have been earlier mentioned, that adopt the policy through their respective procedures. The forest law is constitutionally or legally determined, and procedures are needed through these bodies for their amendment. Now let us understand forest policy formulation. A chronological approach from medieval European history to the modern preservation and environmental movements exhibited the enactment of forest policy to satisfy emerging social requirements, from protection of the sacred to protection of fiber and strategic materials and the key components of economic development to the provision of ecosystems. Since the beginning of the 20th century, political scientists began to describe public policy as a complex system of actors and institutions. As ecology provided a new model for apprehending energy and nutrient flows in complex biophysical systems compared with the species by species description of natural history, as policy as a process began to replace policy as history. Now, today forest policy is often thought of as a process that encompasses 5 stages: setting up of a policy agenda, formulating policy alternatives, adoption of policy choice, execution of programs, and policy assessment. These are the 5 stages through which forest policy evolves and is set up. Further to this, the organizing and committing the necessary human and fiscal and technological resources is also a prerequisite for the successful implementation to realize the policy. Therefore, implementation and execution is also a very important stage. What are the considerations and requirements of an ideal forest policy? A participatory policy development process is costly to begin with, but not having one in the beginning will cost even more. The framework is the following: ascertain the timing, if the timing is right, for the introduction of policy development. Ensure political support and cooperation. Communicate information regularly, broadly, and transparently. Engage stakeholders and nurture joint ownership and accountability. Negotiate to set priorities and resolve conflicts. Align and coordinate with other national policies. Strategize and plan a network of actions for implementation. Now, we shall summarize what we have learnt in this module. Therefore, in the last 40 years, forest policy has been shaped by at least 4 important trends which point to an erosion of public confidence in the ability of governments to preserve the forest resources. These trends embrace the establishment of the basis and signals of forest sustainability, admittance of efficiently managed forests by NGOs, the growing influence of environmental groups using marketing campaigns that affect consumer behavior, and the increasing role of the public participation in public forest management decisions. The National Forest Policy provides the basis for sustainable forest management. It guides the present, the future decisions and determines actions and provides direction over a period of time.